isometric squat at that 3 angle. After warm up to perform it, you probably need 5 to 10 minutes to get that 3 angle done, and then you can predict that 1 RM with the linear regression equation. But if you want to perform a 1 RM, it probably take half an hour or so.
Just one quick update. Our ALLWIN platform recently got approved to offer continuous education courses for allied health professionals, i.e. physiotherapists, speech therapists, etc. And Dr. Danny Lum, the guest of this episode, has said that he's open to holding an isometric workshop for these health professionals, but not limited to them. This means that if you're interested in how isometric training can benefit you, you're most welcome to join us. If you'd like to find out more information, please feel free to check out the link in the description of this video. If not, back to the episode. Hi, Dr. Danny. Welcome to the show.
Yeah. Morning.
Morning. Yeah, we're shooting this at 8 a.m. in the morning. This is the first time I'm doing it in the morning as well. A little of background context for the audience out there. I've been doing a little bit of isometric training, and that's what got me interested in your work. But when I told people about your work, most of them say they don't know anything about you. And I have to introduce you're head of strength conditioning at SSI and things like that. Maybe for a start, I'll just get you to introduce yourself.
I'm Danny Lum. I'm the current team lead for the strength conditioning team in Singapore Sport Institute. I did my undergrad in human movement and exercise science in University of Western Australia. And then in 2012, I took up my master's in sports and exercise study in NTU. And in 2018, I did my PhD again in NTU. And my PhD research was on isometric training.
When exactly did you join SSI, and how's it like back then?
I joined SSI in 2014. Well, back then I wasn't the team lead, so it was a lot less stressful. And back then I was mainly focused on strength conditioning. I didn't do that many research until somewhere around 2017. But even then, my initial interest was more on post-activation performance enhancement. Used to be called post-activation potentiation. Yeah. So that was like a high-intensity warm-up, and then subsequently producing improved power output acutely. I only started isometric training, researching on isometric training when I did my PhD.
How was life before isometric like?
Yeah. Basically, I was a lot more dynamic. My interest was more dynamic because like my master's study, I actually looked at sprint training for endurance athlete, and then like I said, I did some work on PAPE, basically looking at high intensity warm up, high intensity activity for warm up. Yeah, those were a lot more dynamic than isometric training. But when I started training the judo athletes, because I realized that judo involved a lot of isometric phases during the fight, so I added in isometric training. We produced quite a good result for them, and that started my interest in it.
What then led you to continue on the research in isometric? Because I think your first paper on isometric was the application of isometric for dynamic performances.
Yeah. My PhD study initial plan was on isometric test, and then using isometric test to predict dynamic strength. So like isometric squat, predict 1 RM squat, something like that. But I had advice from some of the NTU lecturers to sort of suggest that I change it a little to make it more impactful, because I was already sort of interested in the isometric side of things. And as I continue with my work here, because I saw improvement in the judo athletes, I thought to see how it can work with the swimmers as well. And it worked well for the swimmers that I trained back then, the 3 senior female swimmers. They actually performed well during the SEA Games that year, 2017. Then it sparked my interest, and to see how isometric training can work on other sports. So I started doing a lot more research, looking at how best to implement the isometric training for different groups of people and for different purposes. Then I gained a lot more knowledge on it after I wrote that review paper.
Yeah, correct. In the review paper, quite a few sports were mentioned. But then perhaps as follow-up question from what you just mentioned, maybe you can just explain for those audience out there that are not familiar with isometric, how do you usually tell people about isometric? And secondly, what are the sports that you took before and currently taking?
Okay, for the sports that I took, there were quite a lot over the 10 plus years. Artistic swimming, bowling, cycling, canoeing, diving. Recently I have fin swimming, judo, kayaking. Currently I'm taking the track and field athletes. Actually I started them quite a while back. Yeah, probably 2016. I took triathletes, I took marathon athletes, I took swimming. Sometimes I forget. Yeah, quite a lot of athletes that I took over the past 10 years. Regarding isometric training, isometric, how I usually explain is producing force without any external movement. Basically, like examples are things like wall sit, prone plank. These are the most common isometric training that people do. Then isometric, we categorize them into two types of isometric contraction, hold and push isometric. Hold isometric is when you are resisting a certain force and amount of force and not producing movement. So prone plank and wall sit, that's hold isometric. So you're producing equal force against the resistance. While push isometric is when you are pushing against something you cannot move. So for example, I'm pushing the wall. I'm producing as much force as possible to push the wall, but because the wall is too heavy for me to move, so that's push isometric. There are distinct neural control differences between these two types of isometric contraction, but in general, we still categorize both of them as isometric. Yeah.
Speaking of which, what are the benefits of isometric and how do you utilize isometrics the most in your training?
The few main benefit is safe. It requires little motor control and it takes less time to recover from isometric training. So these are some of the advantage as compared to heavy resistance training. In terms of other benefit, isometric training produces the highest amount of adaptation in terms of angle-specific force development. So for example, if I want to improve my strength at 90-degree elbow angle, so I want to produce as much force as possible in this. So I'll use isometric training as compared to any other modes of training. And because we require less time to recover, so in times whereby I need the athletes to maintain or even improve their force development capability, but yet I want to make sure that the risk of injury is low and the fatiguing level is low. For example, I'm 1 or 2 weeks away from competition. I'll get them to do mainly isometric instead of in replacement to heavy resistance exercise. Yeah. So in that case, I can reduce the risk of overtraining and reduce the risk of injury.
Do you then prescribe isometric for all the sports that you coach?
Every sport I take at various phases and for various joints, I will include isometric training. It's not every single training, it's not every single phase. Some athletes, every phase, there will be isometric, some not. It really depends on the sport itself and what's the requirement. How isometric training is prescribed again also depends on what's the objective of that training phase. Example of athlete that always have isometric training is sprinters, mainly to work on the Achilles tendon. So at every training phase, I will have isometric training for them to work on the Achilles tendon.
When you say to work on Achilles tendon, it is specifically to strengthen the area?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what are some instances where you don't have isometric training in every single phase? I mean, I recently read one of your PDF book where it was complementing plyometric and isometric.
Yeah.
And I saw in every single phase there was a little bit of isometric as well.
That guidebook I wrote was in reference to if someone doesn't want to do heavy resistance training, so for some reason they don't like it, the combination of isometric training and plyometric training may provide them with similar types of adaptation, because isometric training is fully static and plyometric training is like they're at total opposite end of the continuum. One is super dynamic, one is super not doing anything, kind of. Yeah. So yes, that manual is mainly to target those people who don't like heavy resistance training, and they can still get the benefits of heavy resistance training by doing isometric training. Yeah.
What are some instances then where the phases don't include isometric training at all?
Okay. So for example, I usually want to give athletes a variety of modes of training, so that there won't be minimal plateau in their adaptation. So I would change up things here and there, just so that the adaptation doesn't plateau. So some phases I will take out isometric training and then replace it with other modes, for example, maximal, eccentric, and things like this.
Speaking of which, do you have athletes where they are sick of isometric training? Because I know when I'm training myself and also when I'm training some of athletes, isometric training is actually very taxing. And then you do it for a period of 3-4 months, and then in some sessions you don't feel like doing isometric. Yeah.
It does get monotonous. Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I would vary the exercises and then isometric prescription. So for example, at certain phases I would have long contraction, at certain phases I'll make it ballistic and short, and then in combination with other modes of exercise, just so that there's a variation, not just to improve the adaptation, but also to make it less monotonous for the athletes.
Yeah, I saw in Dr. Alex Santera's work where he started off with more sustained isometric and then moving towards ballistic isometric. Is that the same progression that you utilize?
Yeah. So yes, principle is the same. Usually we start off with general and then we make from general to specific. Yeah.
You also did quite a little bit of work, one of which I saw was doing bench pull, right? That seems to be without some of the vault equipment that I have. How do you then set that?
That was the initial part of my PhD study when we did not bring in the vault equipment yet. We were using the force plate from fitness technology. So back then we did not have isometric testing rig as well. So I was quite fortunate that I have very helpful interns. So back then, when we do isometric tests, we always have to load up the barbell. And some athletes are so strong that we have to load the barbell with a lot of weights. Yeah, so then that was how we did it, like loading the barbell every time we need to change that. We have a different athlete coming in with different limb length. We have to change the position of the bar. So we have to take out that we and then put it back on again. Yeah, back then it was fortunate that with my very helpful interns, we managed to pull that off.
Also, so it's purely based on how much load there is.
Yeah, so because we need to make sure that they couldn't pull the bar.
Yes,
the bar couldn't be moved. So we basically have to put as much weight as possible.
Okay.
On the bar, and and then with the bench pull. What we did was we had the bench on the force plate itself.
Okay.
And so when the athlete pull against the bar, the force will be pressed on the bench. And because the bench is on the force plate, so the force will be pressed down onto the force plate.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So that was how it was done. Yeah.
Have you ever tried to replicate that setup?
Yeah. We did testing with the carcass, and the reason why I had that study done for us was also because one of my PhD study, I was looking at isometric training for the carcass, and one of the tests that I want to do was the bench pull test and isometric bench pull. And so before I could actually use that in that study, I have to ensure that the isometric bench pull is validated. So I conducted the isometric bench pull study before I did the intervention study.
Okay. And recently, have you found any better ways to run that?
It's much easier now because we have an isometric testing rig. What we do is we can just simply slot in the bar into the slot, each slot, and then we don't have to actually put weights to keep the bar in place. Yeah.
Is that by vault or?
Vault has it, but we customized our own because we wanted a wider rig, because vault one was it's a lot narrow. It's just slightly wider than shoulder width.
Yeah.
And it's all right for squats and isometric mid-thigh pull, but it's not suitable for upper body tests like isometric bench press or bench pull, whereby especially if you look at some of our athletes, the basketball player or volleyball players, they have such long arms or longer than my legs. Yeah. So the 1x vault won't be able to accommodate their arm length. Yeah.
I saw, and this is in relation to things I'm interested in outside of your studies, some of the equipment you use for your isometric mid-thigh pull. Do you then ask your athletes to do some of these exercises at home by themselves and you teach them? And what else have you experimented with?
We had that, what's that called? Circuit breaker. Yeah. So we did load up some equipment, but mainly whole isometric at that point in time, because I had to consider that they might not have a bar or something to allow them to execute a push isometric. So back then when I prescribed isometric for them, it's mainly whole isometric at sub-maximal intensity. And like a lot of core exercises that we do are also isometric exercises. Yeah, so yes, we do get athletes to do some, especially during the circuit breaker period.
Yeah. Speaking of which, in your review paper, you did state like for hypertrophy or for strength gains, right, or rate of force development, what are the isometric recommendations? I'm just wondering, for rehab, do you have similar recommendations?
For me, when I view rehab, it's not much difference from training for performance. It's a matter of intensity and considering whatever limitations they have at that point in time. Because whether you're injured or whether you're healthy, your body would adapt in a similar way. For example, early phase of rehabilitation, what we usually want is muscle hypertrophy as well. It's pretty much the same as for performance. So the prescription principle will be the same. It's a matter of the intensity. So for example, my 1RM when I was healthy was 100 kilogram, but now that I'm injured, my 1RM is only 50 kilogram. So my isometric training intensity would be relative to what I can do now. But in terms of how I prescribe it, it will be similar.
And then for the joint angle wise, I know you did some research on joint angle as well. How do you then, both for rehab and non-rehab, determine which joint angle you should train at?
See, the adaptation to isometric training is quite similar to dynamic training. So if you read studies on hypertrophy using dynamic training, the results are mainly if you go through a greater range of movement, you will have a better effect on hypertrophy. It's the same as isometric. So if I position myself into a position whereby my muscle is lengthened to a greater range and perform isometric training, I will have a greater amount of hypertrophy as compared to if my position is at where the muscle is shortened. So an example of what's lengthened and shortened is I use my knee angle and quadricep muscle as an example. So if I flex my knee to a 90-degree angle as compared to my knee in 180 degrees, meaning full extension, right? Full extension. Then in a full extension, my quads is shortened. In the 90-degree angle, my quads are lengthened. So if my objective is hypertrophy, then I should be training at 90-degree angle, because that's where the muscle is lengthened. In terms of strength-wise, in general, many people believe that isometric training only improves strength at that particular angle that we train at. It's a yes and no answer. Isometric training will enable you to increase strength the most at that angle that you train at. But the range of strength improvement is also depends on whether you train it at a long muscle length or short muscle length. So if, let's say, if I train at long muscle length, there will be greater benefit through a larger range of movement. So for example, if I train at long muscle length 90 degree, I might get strength gain up to maybe 30-40 degree difference. But if I train at a shorter length, say 150 degree, the range of improvement could be maybe 15 degree or so. So this is just an example. Yeah, it is again dependent on what the objective is. So I think Alex sprint-specific isometric principle. His idea was that we need to produce the highest amount of force the most at this particular range during a sprint. So that's why he recommended that certain exercises you work at certain range, because that is specific to what is required during a sprint. But if, say, you are a different athlete, you have a different objective, then the angle that you want to work at will be at a different angle.
Okay. Speaking about running and strength, some of the following questions are related to those. For example, you also did a research on how your IMTP results correlate to endurance running. Does that mean that if you improve your IMTP results, your running improvement will increase? Do you did like that sort of correlation confirmations?
We need to know, first thing is correlation doesn't mean causation.
Yeah, correct.
So it's likely that faster runner are stronger than lower runner. One reason is because as you run faster, the impact force will be higher. You definitely need to be stronger to sustain that amount of impact force. That is very common. But of course, we have very strong athletes but still not be able to run fast. There's some different factors, mechanism, biomechanics and things involved. In general, let's say all endurance athletes do not do any resistance training. It's most likely that the fastest runner will be the strongest runner. But in general, yes, if you are an endurance runner, I'm talking about just you yourself. Right now, if your endurance training stays the same, you add in strength training, and this strength training leads to improved IMTP result, then I would expect you to be able to run faster. Okay. Because right now you are able to sustain higher amount of force, you can produce force more efficiently.
Okay. Yeah. Then the next question also related to running, and another one of your papers is sustained isometric versus rapid non-sustained contraction.
In that particular study, what I did was I compared two isometric contraction strategy. One was, like you mentioned, the one with sustained, one without sustained. So the one with sustained was a rapid contraction with 3 seconds sustained contraction. The other one was just pull and relax, pull and relax. So what we found was the one with the 3 second contraction ended up with higher strength improvement than the one without sustained because of the total amount of contraction duration. So the one with sustained, in total, it was 15 seconds per set. The one without sustained, it was about 10 seconds per set. So if you multiply by 3 sets, it will be 45 seconds and 30 seconds. So that's 50% difference. So 50% of volume, you would expect that this higher volume would improve more strength than the one with a lower volume. So one reason why I would use sustained contraction is my objective now is to improve as much strength as possible. And in what situation would I use the non-sustained one would be, for example, the isometric training is meant to produce a potentiating effect. So like my main objective is the jump training today. I'll use that non-sustained isometric contraction to sort of potentiate my muscles, excite the nervous system so that I can perform better during the jump.
Speaking of which, you also found there's a potentiating effect if you do like isometrics. So do you then program isometrics as a warm-up?
Yes. There are some warm-up exercises that I get my athletes to do that involve isometric training, but a lot of time I would prescribe iso and plyometric training as a contrast training. So they'll do a low volume set of isometric. So for example, 3 repetitions of rapid contraction, maybe with a 2 seconds sustained contraction so that they don't get too fatigued, and subsequently within 30 to 60 seconds, they'll perform that plyometric mode of training. An example would be 3 repetitions of isometric squat, and then 30 to 60 seconds later, I'll get them to do vertical jump. So this pair is a contrast pair, and that would be 1 set, and then they'll do like a couple of sets for that. Yeah.
So this is warming up for a gym training or warming up for a race day?
Oh no, that is the main exercise. That's the main set for that strength training session. So that's the contrast set. But if we're talking about competition, we will do some other forms of isometric stuff. Not all athletes, because some athletes, they already have their own warm-up that they are used to. I have not experimented with them on the inclusion of isometric contraction yet. So it's like not every athlete that has this protocol yet.
Yeah. Okay. Moving on to some of the later research you have done, specifically those this year. Earlier in this year, you published a paper on comparing the DSI ratio versus the percentage of isometric mid-thigh pull peak force produced during early epoch.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Quite a few technical terms here. So
okay. We go to DSI first. So dynamic strength index. What it is you have to do two tests, counter movement jump test and isometric mid-thigh pull test. Then you get the peak force from counter movement jump, divide by isometric mid-thigh pull's peak force, and then you get a certain value, right?
Right. Yep.
So the theory behind it is the peak force for isometric mid-thigh pull would be the greatest amount of force you can produce. So that's the theoretical peak force that your lower limb can produce. And how much of this peak force can you transfer to a dynamic movement? So that's where the peak force for counter movement jump comes in.
Yeah,
right. In theory, isometric mid-thigh pull's peak force will always be higher than counter movement jump's peak force, right? So you get that ratio. And then based on literature, if your ratio is below 0.6, it's considered that you might have high strength, but you are not dynamic enough. But if your ratio is 0.8 and above, then it suggests that, okay, you can transfer that peak force to dynamic performance very efficiently. So that's dynamic strength index. A few years back, Dr. Paul Comfort came up with this study whereby when we do isometric mid-thigh pull, we don't just get the peak force measure, we can get the early force development measure as well. What he did was use this method as a form of monitoring to see what your training has improved. Is it the explosive force or is it that peak force only? So to do that, you take your pre-training test result. So I take explosive force development, I use force developed at 100 milliseconds. So I take 100 milliseconds divide by my isometric mid-thigh pull peak force, that I get a certain number. So after training, I do the same thing. 100 milliseconds divide by my peak force, and I get another number. So let's say my pre-training value was 0.5. So that means the 100 milliseconds force was 50% of the peak force, right? Post-training, I want to see, is it still 0.5 or is it less or higher? So if it's higher, then what it meant is that this training that I went through probably improved my explosive strength more than my maximum strength. But if this ratio is lower, it means that this particular training improved my maximum strength more than my explosive strength. So in theory, it's quite similar to the dynamic strength index.
Yep.
Right. So that was why I wanted to look at whether there's any correlation between these two values, but the result was there wasn't. Very simple explanation is that they're both very different activity. One is just a very raw force development. One is a counter movement jump. First, it's dynamic, it's ballistic, and second, it involves different motor control as well. So these are factors that end up showing that there's no correlation.
So a takeaway is that you have to train both?
Takeaway is that you have to test both. But nowadays, I move away from dynamic strength index, having better understanding of all these force parameters and measures, because it's very easy for me to change my counter movement jump peak force. So even without a training intervention, I just have to change my jump strategy, my counter movement jump peak force will change. So I move away from dynamic strength index because of that, because jumps at different training phase can be very different. I get my athletes to do pure strength training versus one with plyometric training. After this different training, the jump result can change, not simply because of the force generation capability, but the jump strategy can change also. So that's one of the reasons why I move away from dynamic strength index. But of course, I still do counter movement jump tests as well, just to see, because we still want to look at whether there's improvement in jump height or not. Whether it's a change in jump strategy, a change in jump height is still a good sign because on the ground, on the field, it would transfer well to performance.
Speaking of which, is this one of those things that you say, the more you research, you realize the more you don't know?
Yes. A few months back, I went for a conference. There was this very senior professor, William Kramer. So he was mentioning years ago, he thought he knows everything. But now, after decades of research, he wondered he's even right about anything. Yeah, so it's the same. The more you know, the more you don't know.
Okay, moving on to one of the more recent publications, you were doing something about 1 rep max measurement.
It was a FYP project for one of our NTU interns. What we did was we measured isometric squat at 3 different positions. So 60-degree knee angle, 90-degree, and 120-degree knee angle. And we use the peak force produced at this 3 angle to predict a 1 RM squat. So what we found was that it's quite accurate. On average, the difference is only about 0.2% difference from the actual 1 RM using the peak force produced, and we plug it into a linear regression equation, and then we predicted the 1 RM squat. But of course, there's still a range up to about 10%. It's still a good sign. Previous studies, they only use peak force produced from one joint position. The percentage difference is as high as 5 to 8% on average. So because average is already 5 to 8, you could expect the range to be 20-30% difference. So this time round, we use 3 position because 3 position would account for force development at different range of movement. So that's why we saw a higher accuracy. There are factors affecting it. First thing is not just the knee angle that we need to be consistent with, it's ankle and the hip joint angle as well. The bar position during the isometric test has to be exactly the same as during the dynamic squat. So if all these are not replicated properly, then definitely the accuracy will be much lower. Then what we also found was that male and female, we had to use a different regression equation, probably due to postural difference and the way they execute the squat and stuff like that. We definitely need multiple familiarization sessions because people are quite familiar with how to perform a dynamic squat, but when it comes to isometric squat, it's a different mode of contraction. They might not get used to it yet until probably 2 or 3 sessions. So these are factors we have to account for if we actually want to use the isometric squat test to predict the 1 RM.
So how does it translate to a coach's practice?
It takes less time to perform the isometric squat once you have all the angles measured. Isometric squat at that 3 angle. After warm up to perform it, you probably need 5 to 10 minutes to get that 3 angle done, and then you can predict that 1 RM with the linear regression equation. But if you want to perform a 1 RM, it probably take half an hour or so. And also with the isometric squat test, it's definitely a lot safer. The risk of injury is a lot less as compared to dynamic squat. But of course, we know that seasoned athletes probably have already quite low risk with the dynamic squat, but still the safety is there. Time can save up half to 2/3 of the time, and it's less tiring as well. So these are the advantage. But of course, we need to know that there's still that plus minus 10% error in there. It's up to coaches whether they want to go with it or not. Definitely for athletes like powerlifter, they will still need to do that 1 RM. But if I'm talking about athletes from other sports, if I can save them from the risk, I can save them from the fatigue, then why not?
Speaking of which, I think that was the last paper that we talked about. Do you have more that you are working on?
Right now, I'm also doing a follow-up on that isometric squat study. So we know that we can predict, but what happens after a period of training? Is it still going to be consistent, like 1 RM improve, and then the predicted 1 RM also improve at the same rate? So that's one of the follow-up study I'm doing. Another 2 study that is pending submission. I mentioned about the hold and push isometric. So we did an intervention study previously on the difference between adaptation using the push and hold isometric. So we are trying to get it published right now. There is another study that I actually did with SIT physiotherapy student, was that just sitting down here and contracting my muscles to see if there's any improvement in functional performance. Protocols was very simple. We just sit down, contract our muscle, every muscles on the lower limb, and then relax. Right, so you can do that while watching TV. What we found was that it improved our strength, it improved walking speed, ability to sit and stand. The only drawback was we only had 8 participants and we did not have any control. So right now, what I'm doing is getting my overseas counterpart to carry out the study because I don't have funding for it. It's very hard to get sedentary individuals who don't like to exercise to actually participate in the study. Yeah. So I outsource it to my overseas collaborator because he works in the university. It will be easier for him to get participants. Yeah, so we'll see how it goes.
Speaking of that study, last 2 questions. Firstly, is isometric appropriate for kids?
Isometric training is definitely suitable for kids. I will implement whole isometric for them first because whole isometric is at sub-maximal intensity. In order to do whole isometric training, it's very simple. You see a lot of examples like kids doing prone plank, doing wall sit. You see Shaolin, they maintain that horse stance for don't know how long. Yeah, those are isometric training. Yes, so there's no issue for kids to do whole isometric. In order for them to do the push isometric, we need to make sure that they have very good control of their posture. So for example, if I'm getting them to do a push isometric squat, if they don't have the ability to maintain that upright posture, they can injure their back, or even though isometric is already a low risk, with proper training, proper education, they can slowly progress to a push isometric. In general, there isn't any issue with kids doing isometric.
And secondly, there was a paper you did on isometrics versus plyometric for run economy. Both improve run economy, but you mentioned it was using different mechanisms, right? Yeah, just shed a little bit of light on that as well.
Okay, with that endurance running study, first we need to know the mechanisms of adaptation for plyometric and isometric. And before that, the other thing is what happens when we do a fast stretch shortening cycle. So for example, if I'm doing this, there's a stretch and then there's a shortening. All right, so there's a stretch shortening cycle. Running involves a lot of rapid stretch shortening cycle because we land and then we stretch the muscle, and then when we propel, we shorten the muscle, right? So that's a rapid stretch shortening. During rapid stretch shortening cycle, the muscle is actually in somewhat isometric state. So the muscle will contract, maintain isometric contraction, and then the tendon will be lengthened as the joint position changes. And then what we want is a strong recoil from the tendon so that we can propel ourselves more efficiently. If we do run training, plyometric training, there's a lot of rapid stretch shortening cycle. So what we actually do is we improve the active stiffness of the muscle's ability to maintain in isometric state. So with all this ballistic training, the main adaptation is on the active muscle stiffness. On the other hand, isometric training, during isometric contraction, the muscle length actually continues to shorten while the tendon lengthens slowly. Unlike during dynamic contraction, whereby the muscle maintains relatively isometric, the tendon stretch quickly. Tendon adapts better with a slow strain, slow but high strain. And that's why isometric training improves tendon stiffness more than plyometric training. So the difference in terms of adaptation is basically one works more on active muscle stiffness, one works more on tendon stiffness. Most of the runners would have been more familiar with plyometric training, so they didn't get as much improvement in that tendon stiffness as compared to the group who did isometric training. So those who did isometric training, the tendon stiffness improved. So when they run, they would be stretching the tendon that is more stiff, right? As you stretch a tendon that's stiffer, the recoil will be greater. So that is one of the reasons why running economy is improved, because with the same amount of force they produce, they get a greater recoil. So they save more energy from actively contracting the muscle.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's very insightful.
Yeah.
I didn't get so much insight from reading the paper, although I thought I understood it.
Yes, I did explain that, but I did not actually evidence it because I did not have the equipment to actually measure the change in tendon stiffness. It was more of a speculative thing, but it's well evident in separate studies done by other people that the difference in adaptation between plyometric and isometric is the muscle and the tendon physiology. Yeah.
With that said, I am about to wrap up the session. before that, do you want to share like your handle and your website?
My X and Instagram is Danny Lum 82. Yeah. And my website is theperformanceconcept.com.
With that, we wrap up today's session. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact Dr. Danny. Till next time, take care.